Hello, Endeavor here. Don Quixote is one of the most influential works of fiction of all time. Written in two parts by the Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra in the early 17th century, the book tells the story of the comedic adventures of a bumbling knight, Don Quixote of La Mancha. Driven mad by his obsession with romantic stories of knightly chivalry, Don Quixote decides to become a knight-errant, put on an old suit of armor, and set off in pursuit of his lady love, Dulcinea del Toboso, who is nothing more than an idealized figment of his imagination. Don Quixote constantly finds himself in absurd, farcical situations as a result of his relentless pursuit of his conception of the ideals of knightly chivalry. His numerous mishaps throughout his travels include mistaking an innkeeper and prostitutes for a lord of a castle and fine ladies, challenging random strangers to battle over trivial misunderstandings which he interprets as affronts to his honor, and even charging at windmills, believing them to be giant long-armed beasts, hoping to prove his valor in battle. The character of Don Quixote and his misadventures served as the origins of a word used to describe this particular kind of foolishness. The word Quixotism, translations of which can be found in a number of languages, denotes overcommitment to romantic ideals, often resulting in reckless and irrational action in pursuit of such. More simply put, Quixotism means idealism without practicality. While the fictional character Don Quixote served as the inspiration for this word, if there were ever a real-life individual to embody the folly of Quixotism, it would be the naturalist and documentary filmmaker Timothy Treadwell. As a nature lover, Timothy had a deep infatuation with bears in particular. He spent 13 summers in a row, starting in 1990, camping in Katmai National Park in Alaska, where he would observe and record footage of the various species of bears which inhabited the Alaskan wilderness. Timothy became well known in both media and environmentalist circles for his activism and the footage he captured of bears during his stays in Katmai National Park. However, he received criticism from park officials and the broader naturalist community for putting himself in danger in order to obtain this footage and disturbing the wildlife. Timothy said that he hated human civilization and that he felt at peace living in the forest among the bears. He never brought a firearm or even bear spray with him on his expedition and refused to set up electric fences around his campsites. Timothy stated that he would never use a weapon against a bear, even if attacked, but felt confident that this would never happen as he believed he had a spiritual connection with the bears and that they were misunderstood creatures. In summer 2003, Timothy spent the season in Katmai National Park as he had the 12 preceding years, although on this occasion he was accompanied by his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard. They stayed into October, which was later in the year than usual. By this time, the bears were hunting more aggressively as they prepared for their winter hibernation. On October 6, 2003, the pilot who was supposed to pick them up found their campsite abandoned, save for a bear chewing on what appeared to be human remains. While it has never been released, an audio recording exists of Timothy screaming in agony as he's mauled to death by a brown bear. Since Timothy refused to carry a gun or bear spray on his expeditions, the best weapon Amy had at her disposal was a frying pan. Needless to say, this proved ineffective in preventing the bear from ripping Timothy limb from limb before turning its attention to Amy and doing the same. What better word to describe Timothy Treadwell's specific brand of stupidity than Quixotism? His starry-eyed dream of living in perfect harmony with wildlife in an everlasting bond of mutual love and understanding blinded him to the facts of nature. A wild animal is just that. He abandoned all practicality in pursuit of naive idealism. He might have been able to delude himself into thinking he had a deep spiritual connection with the bears of Katmai National Park, but the bears themselves saw Timothy as nothing more than their next meal. It's not only individuals who are susceptible to the folly of Quixotism. This phenomenon can manifest itself on a society-wide scale too and have a profound impact on politics. Many of the blunders of communist regimes of the 20th century can be attributed to Quixotic thinking among their ruling parties. For example, during the so-called Great Leap Forward in Mao's China, all economic reality was ignored in favor of Maoist ideological purity. Production quotas were placed upon commodities such as grain or steel, not in accordance with economic feasibility or necessity, but in a desperate attempt to exceed the output of capitalist countries, thus proving the superiority of communism. This resulted in over-reporting of production out of fear of not meeting quotas, exporting too much grain to the cities, leaving the countryside famished, and overproduction of steel, which proved useless due to its low quality and lack of demand. Estimates for the death toll caused by the fallout from the Great Leap Forward range from as low as 15 million to as high as 55 million. Some deaths were the result of disease, forced labor, or execution, but the vast majority were the results of famine. Despite people dying of starvation by the tens of millions, Mao continued to export grain abroad and refused any international aid, all in an attempt to maintain the appearance that China was well on its way to achieving the Marxist fantasy of the workers' utopia. In today's world, the phenomenon of Quixotism is having a major impact on the political trajectory of the West. Last year, Harold Robertson wrote his now famous article titled "Complex Systems Won't Survive the Competence Crisis." Robertson writes of how the ideology of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, laws such as the Civil Rights Act, and affirmative action programs have eroded the human capital of the United States. Over the past 6 decades, this has decreased the efficiency of the complex systems which the country relies on to function. The Quixotism of the American ruling class, whether motivated by naive egalitarian delusions or malignant anti-white hatred, or a bit of both, is jeopardizing the continued status of the United States as a global superpower. Quixotism is easy to spot when it's others falling victim of it, but it's much harder to recognize in oneself. As a right-winger myself, it's easy for me to see Quixotic thinking on the left for the foolishness that it is. It's a lot harder to look inward and recognize when the side of the political spectrum which I lean towards is guilty of the same. Upon self-reflection, I find that we on the right fall prey to Quixotism just as often, if not more often, than the left. I can think of 3 segments of the right who have engaged in Quixotic wrong-headedness over the past decade or so. I'm not a fan of the political compass as an accurate model to describe political views, but if I were to use it here, one of these segments would be in the top right quadrant, one would be in the bottom right, and one would be between the two. Before I get into these, I need to make it clear that I don't mean to imply that every adherent of these following movements holds the positions I'm going to criticize here. However, these are positions which either a sizable portion or prominent individuals associated with these movements have argued for. So don't accuse me of strawmanning these ideologies if you personally do not believe in these positions, because I have examples of people who do. I can't include all of them in this video, but they're all available on the Substack version of this video. The first section of the right guilty of Quixotism is what we normally refer to as either mainstream conservatism or classical liberalism. These labels are somewhat misleading since mainstream conservatism doesn't conserve anything and classical liberalism is nothing like the liberalism of the 19th century, but rather progressive liberalism from 30 years ago. The proponents of what we call mainstream conservatism tend to be boomers who want to go back to the 1980s, while those who identify as classic liberals tend to be Gen Xers who want to go back to the 1990s. Nonetheless, I'm just going to merge these two groups under the banner of conservatism for the purposes of this video, since I don't think there's a significant difference between the two. In the present day, conservatism exists mostly as a reaction to the political trends of the past decade or so, with the goal of bringing back the perceived normalcy of a few decades ago. Conservatives stress the importance of individual rights, personal responsibility, and meritocracy in response to the rise of identity politics and cancel culture, or wokeness as this has come to be known. Their response to anti-white policies in law, education, and the business world, or just the general anti-white animosity in the culture, is to say that we should treat everyone as an individual, and not consider race of any importance to the identity of an individual or society as a whole. They apply similar criticisms to other identity-based movements on the left, such as feminism or the LGBT agenda. Conservatives are always quick to point out how the left is guilty of the same prejudice they claim to be against, just in the opposite direction. It's become a cliche at this point that conservatives will say that the woke should follow the advice of Martin Luther King Jr. and judge others by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. It's important to note that this is an incorrect interpretation of Martin Luther King Jr. The "judge not by the color of the skin but content of character" is a single quote from a speech which he didn't even write himself. In reality, Martin Luther King Jr. supported affirmative action and reparations. He most certainly would be on the side of the woke today. But conservatives often erroneously use him as an example of race blindness. Conservatives often argue that equality of opportunity should be the goal rather than equality of outcome. They advocate a purely meritocratic system which, in theory, would give everyone the equal opportunity to rise to the top, but wouldn't necessarily result in equal outcomes. Their answer to the unequal outcomes between various demographic groups is that reliance on government handouts has prevented certain demographics from attaining an equal degree of success, and that they can increase their standing by taking on a greater degree of self-reliance. Conservatives argue that ideas should form the basis of society rather than heredity. They advocate civic nationalism while opposing ethnic nationalism. They believe that the unifying force should not be shared ancestry, but a shared set of values such as those found in the Constitution of the United States. They argue that anyone can integrate into a country regardless of their background if they adopt the values and culture of said country. They make an exception for the State of Israel. The fatal flaw of conservatism, at least its present-day iteration, is that it is fundamentally an egalitarian universalist ideology which seeks to hold back the inevitable consequences of said egalitarian universalism. The state which Western countries find themselves in the 2020s is just a natural result of the belief system which they adopted in the years following the Second World War. The fundamental principles underlying Wokism had already been firmly established by the 80s and 90s, the decades which conservatives wished so desperately they could recreate. We were already on the trajectory to where we are today back then. We're just further along now. The problem is that conservatives refuse to accept this reality. They continue to desperately hold on to these values, even as these values are the very driving force behind their own disenfranchisement. For example, conservatives say we shouldn't place any kind of value on collective racial identity and that we should see everyone as an individual. However, a supermajority of those who identify as either conservatives or classic liberals are white, while a supermajority of non-whites or other alleged victim groups ally with the left. Even if conservatives don't want to identify as white themselves, these other groups most certainly will identify them as such. Race and sex are biological realities which will inevitably impact the average outcomes of members of various demographic backgrounds in society. Both the left and the mainstream right deny this reality. The left explains it away as a function of systemic discrimination, thus giving us woke politics. Conservatives don't really have any answers and are just left pleading for this reality to not be taken into any consideration at all. However, these client groups which form the left's coalition have zero incentive to do that because their ability to collectivize under such identities is the main source of their elevated political power and social status. The Quixotism of conservatives, the vast majority of whom are white, is that they disempower themselves politically by refusing to acknowledge and pursue their own group interests, in order to stay true to a set of principles which in no way benefit them. Their principles only serve to give them a feeling of comfort and self-righteousness. They yearn for the common stability of previous eras in which they felt comfortable, but they don't want to rock the boat by confronting the harsh realities which brought us to where we are today. So they are reduced to hoping that it all just goes away. To get an idea of just how impotent conservatism is, consider this. They constantly advocate for a purely meritocratic system which doesn't account for race, gender, or sexuality at all. The problem is that legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as similar legislation found in other countries, essentially makes that illegal. These laws require companies to engage in discrimination in favor of so-called protected groups, lest they be struck with massive lawsuits. Yet they would never have the courage to suggest such a thing. On the contrary, they're constantly lauding the virtue of Martin Luther King Jr., the icon of the civil rights movement, as if he were some kind of role model. Sam Francis fittingly described conservatives as beautiful losers. They don't actually want to succeed politically as much as they want to show how principled they are as they lose. Conservatism is like a country which dismantles its entire military to show how peaceful they are, then complains how mean a rival country is being when they invade. They continue their decades-long losing streak on account of their Quixotism. Their principles have been proven to destroy that which they seek to conserve, yet they continue to hold on to them, not wanting to leave their political comfort zone. I'm sure most listening to this will have long since learned this truth about conservatism. We all can see that the mainstream right has held on to these naive ideals far past the point of all practicality. Unfortunately, however, the Quixotism of the right is not limited to the stale and dreary mainstream. The past decade or two has seen the rise and fall of an alternative to mainstream conservatism in libertarianism. If we were to use the political compass as our model, conservatism would sit between the upper and lower right quadrants, while libertarianism would be found in the lower right quadrant. The selling point of libertarianism was the reduction of government regulations and state power in favor of increased personal liberty and autonomy. Libertarianism became a trendy alternative to the mainstream right during the 2000s and 2010s. Libertarians held several positions in common with the mainstream right, such as the reduction of taxes and opposition to gun control, but opposed foreign military intervention and the expansion of the surveillance state, policies which many conservatives supported during the 2000s. Libertarianism was certainly appealing for many on the right. After all, excessive taxation and government regulation, increasingly restrictive gun ownership laws, wasteful expenditures on war in the Middle East, and the encroaching surveillance state are all examples of government overreach which many were dissatisfied with. Opposing the increasingly intrusive expansion of government into all aspects of modern life was what gained libertarianism a following. It was libertarianism's slide into Quixotism which lost it. While they shared a lot in common with the right, some libertarians embrace several ideas associated with the left, such as the decriminalization of drugs, more liberal immigration policies, and support for the LGBT movement. They argued that the government shouldn't be able to dictate which substances an individual can or cannot take, that free movement of labor is an essential part of the free market, and that the LGBT movement was a matter of personal liberty. There was a libertarian meme back in the day that they wanted gay couples using their guns to defend their privately owned marijuana farms. This created a divide within libertarianism, as it was at odds with the socially conservative leanings of a lot of libertarians, while others argued that it was consistent with their underlying principles. Most who had adopted libertarianism did not have armed homosexuals selling drugs to their children in mind as their idea of liberty. It didn't stop there, however. Libertarians took the idea, government equals bad, free market equals good, and ran with it to the point of absurdity. Libertarians started calling for the abolition of all taxation and the entire governmental and state apparatus. Libertarianism became a one-upsmanship contest where one would prove their cred by proclaiming how strongly they were opposed to government regulations, no matter how insane the policies they were arguing for were. This resulted in libertarians taking ludicrous positions under the premise that less government is always better. You could meet libertarians who would argue that it should be legal to sell illicit drugs to children, that police forces should be abolished altogether, that countries should have no borders at all, that child labor should be legalized, or that you shouldn't need a license in order to drive a car. Some rather repulsive individuals identifying as libertarians even went so far as to argue that age of consent laws should be abolished because that's government. Not only did this Quixotic pissing contest make libertarianism look unserious and infantile, the years following 2016 have totally discredited their ideology. For example, during the wave of mass censorship of the internet from 2017 to 2021, the discussion online within right-wing and center-right circles turned to the need for legislation to prevent social media companies from banning users for legal political speech alone. As they fall under the umbrella of the broader political right, many libertarians found themselves the targets of censorship too. Nevertheless, they still argued against any kind of legislation preventing social media companies from enacting censorship on the grounds that these were private companies, and thus government intervention to regulate them is wrong. Libertarians' Quixotism got them to the point where they opposed legislation designed to protect they themselves against censorship at the hands of a private company. They tried to cram this issue through the frame of their ideology by arguing that if a company censored content viewers wanted to see, the market would punish the company and reward free speech alternatives. This has been proven wildly incorrect, as the engagement dissident right content creators get on alternative platforms is merely a fraction of that which they got in 2016. Before the major push for online censorship. But even this didn't get libertarians to change their opinions. When President Donald Trump was banned from Twitter in 2021 while still in office, rather than seeing this as an egregious affront to freedom of speech and a warning sign of impending corporate tyranny, some libertarians actually rejoiced. Why? Because it was being done by a private company. Another product of their Quixotic thinking is that many libertarians have argued for open borders and unlimited immigration on the grounds that the market demand for labor should determine immigration and that the state doesn't have the right to regulate this. Whenever the issue of illegal immigration crops up in the United States, libertarian parties are sure to chime in, arguing that there shouldn't be a border at all. If you want a smaller state and lower taxes, this is an insane position to take, as it has been long established that non-white immigrants overwhelmingly side with the left and favor the expansion of the welfare state. It's how they transfer wealth from the white population to themselves. Yet libertarians continue to argue for open borders because of this idiotic first principle that any use of government force is always bad. Libertarians disregard the burning issues of our time, demographics, nihilism, social atomization, by accusing those who are confronting them of being statists or collectivists. They often respond with the phrase, "How does this affect you personally?" The reality is that the collective stability and well-being of society matters to everyone, and you can't simply close yourself off in a little bubble and expect to be left alone. We could have safe, prosperous, and cohesive countries again, though part of the solution would include strict immigration policies, competent police forces, and a crackdown on subversive elements in media and education. But many libertarians would have none of this because it would involve the use of the state. So instead, libertarians are out there raving about how wonderful it is that illegal immigrants are being allowed to purchase firearms. This obsession with ideology and total disregard for the reality of the world we actually live in got many on the right to abandon libertarianism. One of the many lessons COVID taught us is that the line between government and big business is being blurred. The two function almost as one entity today. It's now referred to as the public-private partnership. The state and corporations colluded in order to impose themselves into the minutest aspects of everyone's lives for 2 years. And even after COVID, we still see smaller scale collusion of this nature all the time. The Quixotism of libertarians has gotten them to the point where they would support themselves being hauled off to the gulag, as long as the gulag was run by a private company and not the state. In response to the fall of libertarianism into outlandishness, a new strand of the right became trendy in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Referring back to the political compass, while libertarianism sits on the bottom right quadrant, this ideology sits on the top right. While I'm sure most of my listeners will already agree with me on my criticisms of the Quixotism of conservatism and libertarianism, I imagine I'm going to step on a few toes with what I'm going to say next. However, I feel for that reason this is even more important to say. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to this ideology as third positionism. Third positionism came into existence in the early 20th century following the First World War in opposition to the rise of communism, but also as an alternative to capitalism. Iterations of this worldview took hold in Italy in the form of fascism and in Germany in the form of National Socialism during the interwar period, but died off following the defeat of these regimes in World War II. The events of the past decade have exposed just how untenable of a position libertarianism is. There's the broader issue of the emptiness and nihilism which the materialistic consumerism of neoliberalism has brought about, and the more recent phenomenon of how ideologically progressive major corporations have become. In the era of woke capital, it's clear as day that big business is just as responsible for the ills facing our society as Western governments are, and that any realistic solution to our problems would involve bringing privately held capital to heel. A portion of libertarians embrace the concept of race realism throughout the 2010s. For many libertarians, this caused a shift in their core principles from limited government to ethnic nationalism. In the second half of the 2010s, this became known as the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. From there, many former libertarians began to rethink their prior stance that government intervention is always a bad thing, and accept that at least a degree of government power will be necessary in a stable society. They, along with former conservatives and even some converted former leftists, make up what is broadly referred to today as the dissident right. Third positionism became a popular ideology among the dissident right in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Along with ethnic nationalism and race realism, this strand of the dissident right favors a more socialistic economy in opposition to neoliberal capitalism, advocates a strong state and the use of government force, opposes classically liberal values, and puts a strong emphasis on the issue of influence and Zionism within the elite class. As with libertarianism, I see the initial appeal. Race realism and collective ethnic identity were glaring omissions from conservatism in most iterations of libertarianism. The neoliberal capitalism which the right supported for decades is a problem, even more so in the age of woke capital. Privatization is not always better. If you're serious about attaining power, you can't shy away from using the force of the state. This is likewise a pressing issue. Have had a massively disproportionate amount of power in Western countries for decades now, and they've done more than any group to promote mass third world immigration, anti-white narratives, feminism, homosexuality, affirmative action, and censorship. These have become standard dissident right positions, and these are essential issues to confront for anyone hoping to build a more ordered and stable society. So this perspective offered a very legitimate critique of mainstream right-wing thought up to that point. But the third positionist strand of the right, as well as many on the dissident right more broadly, eventually found themselves guilty of Quixotism too, just as conservatism and libertarianism before them. What happened with the third positionists is that they became obsessed with certain aspects of this worldview to the point where they overshadowed more important ones. This was largely the result of both an unhealthy obsession with 1930s Germany, as well as excessive contrarianism against mainstream conservatism and libertarianism. While the is an important aspect of understanding the nature of power in the Western world. For many third positionists, it became the be-all and end-all explanation for everything happening in the world today. The organized community is probably the most disproportionately powerful group in the Western world, and they certainly do wield a significant degree of power. However, they are only one of a number of groups vying for power today. Historically, their power has ebbed and flowed, increasing in one area at one time, then later declining, only to arise again somewhere else. The problem with the third positionist camp is that they came to the conclusion that have 100% power over everything in the Western world, and have had this amount of power for all of modern history, except for in Germany from 1934 to 1945. This brought them to the conclusion that in the state of Israel have 100% control over America, and that America has 100% control over every other Western country, meaning have 100% control over them too. They also came to the conclusion that since the mainstream right supports Zionism, everything they believe must be incorrect and must have been designed by the to misdirect the right. In addition, rather than just acknowledging that state power is necessary at times, they came to the conclusion that the use of state power in and of itself is based, and that asking for any kind of limits on it is liberalism and therefore not based. These obsessions led to third positionists throwing around the label of Zionist, liberal, or controlled opposition around, aimed at anyone on the right with the slightest ideological differences. If you think China's massive surveillance grid and social credit system are excessive, then you're a liberal who just happens to be racist. If you acknowledge the but you don't think they've put extra J's in your alphabet soup, then you're controlled opposition trying to obfuscate power. If you believe that Islam poses a threat to the West, then you're a Zionist shill who supports wars in the Middle East for the benefit of Israel. These accusations had become commonplace by 2019, but COVID was when third positionist Quixotism really started to show. When the initial lockdown started in 2020, the online right really didn't know how to react. Some thought it was a reasonable precaution as we still didn't know how dangerous the virus was, while others dove straight into the conspiracy theories. After some time, it became clear that the lockdowns were unnecessary and doing far more harm than the actual virus itself. From there, most on the right adopted the position that the restrictions at best were the result of idiocy on the part of the establishment, or at worst, part of a more nefarious agenda. This became glaringly obvious after mass demonstrations were allowed during the summer of Floyd after everyone had been locked down for the 2 preceding months. When the COVID injections were rolled out in 2021, most on the right opposed the following mandates tooth and nail. The third positionists, however, tried to force the issue of COVID into the frame of their ideology where it really didn't fit. Since their ideology supports the strong arm of the state, they accused those on the right who oppose the lockdowns of being liberals or libertarians. With the vaccine rollout, third positionists argued that there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with these injections because Israel was giving them to their own citizens. And since everything in the world is one big conspiracy to benefit the then these injections must therefore be safe. Third positionists also accuse those vocally opposing the COVID restrictions of being controlled opposition, trying to distract everyone from the real issue of power. After all, if mainstream conservative commentators were opposed to the COVID measures, and if their sole reason for existence is to serve the then it can't possibly be a serious issue, right? Some members of this crowd dismiss the whole issue of COVID and other related issues such as sustainable development altogether as being of no interest whatsoever on the simple basis that the poster boys, Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab, aren't themselves. After their humiliatingly bad commentary during COVID, the Quixotic echo chamber of third positionism continued to churn out idiotic takes. Since they're of the belief that equals America equals the West equals Israel, and that this is the sole cause of everything bad in the world, they began loudly cheering on America's geopolitical enemies such as China, Russia, and Iran, in hopes that these powers would bring about the downfall of the United States and thus the downfall of the Their reasoning was that since control America and America controls the world, anyone against America must be against the and therefore anyone America doesn't like must be their ally and share the same ideological suppositions. This has now gotten to the point where the talking points of some of these self-proclaimed national socialists are almost indistinguishable from those of some post-colonial third worldist from some obscure African backwater. The Quixotism of third positionism was taken to a whole new level in October 2023 when the current iteration of the Israel-Palestine conflict broke out. This crowd has been shedding crocodile tears for Gaza for months on end now as some kind of 4D underwater chess move to score some points against the They've even gone so far as to put the Palestinian flag in their social media profiles and elevate some deranged anti-white leftist who lit himself on fire to protest Israel to the level of sainthood, claiming he quote-unquote struck a massive blow against And of course, they'll accuse anyone on the right who doesn't play along of being a Zio-liberal boomercon rightoid Israel shill. You know what's been lost in the Quixotism of third positionism? What is actually good for people of European descent? The disastrous response to COVID caused enormous financial, psychological, and physical harm to countless people across the West. Yet rather than try to hold the establishment responsible for the damage they caused, the third positionist crowd dismissed the entire ordeal because it couldn't be pinned on Israel, and because normicons and libertarians made it cringe to talk about it. I need to emphasize that I'm not denying nor downplaying the issue of influence, so if I get any comments accusing me of this, I'm just gonna block you. I've spent the last 5 years talking about this issue at lengths, and I can assure you, anonymous YouTube commenter, I've done a lot more to wake people up to it than you have. I'm simply asking that our understanding of this issue be accurate, and that it doesn't overshadow the core issue of what is actually in the interests of whites. Because the question for third positionists is no longer what actually benefits us, but rather what is bad for the based on the assumption that, since this is the sole factor at play in the world, anything bad for them must benefit us by default. The crux of the JQ is that they are a separate ethno-religious group with a disproportionate amount of power, whose interests are in conflict with the white majorities of the countries which they have influence over. But they are only one group whose interests conflict with those of Europeans. The Chinese do not share our interests either. The rise of China does not benefit the West in the least. Their goal isn't to liberate the West from influence, but rather supplant the current hostile elite ruling class in the West with their own. Let's say China overtakes America and becomes the global superpower. Is it in their interests to allow white nationalists to rise to power in the West, forming a potential threat to their hegemony? No, it isn't. And we can look at how China deals with the Uyghurs or the Tibetans in their own country to give us an idea how they'd prevent that from happening. For a less theoretical example, let's look at the pro-Palestine movement in the West today, a cause which the third positionist segment of the right has spent almost all of their energy championing for months now. It's a coalition of Islamists and leftists, some of whom are white, some of whom are non-white, and a few of whom are actually themselves. The position of Islamists is simple. They want Islam to subjugate the West. The only difference between the Zionist camp and the pro-Palestine leftist camp is that the Zionists want universalist egalitarianism for every country except Israel, and the pro-Palestine leftist camp want universalist egalitarianism for every country including Israel. They're not part of the white race. They are a separate ethnic group. Nevertheless, the pro-Palestine camp erroneously considers them white, and thus applies the label of settler colonialist oppressor to them as well. This divide within the West is between two separate factions which are both ardently opposed to white interests, fighting over the status of a foreign country way off in the Middle East. While it is within the interests of Western countries to end all aid to Israel, the broader cause associated with the pro-Palestine movement is at odds with our interests too, just like Zionism. The 65-year-old neocon boomers who relentlessly support Israel despite all the damage the lobby has done to their country have become a joke, and rightfully so. But are the third positionists really any better? Through their misguided Quixotism, they've convinced themselves that they're in an alliance with people who, given the chance, would have them lined up against a wall and shot. The folly of Quixotism can be found across the political spectrum, and almost all segments of the right have been guilty of Quixotic thinking over the past decade at one point or another. So the question is, how can we avoid Quixotism? The simple answer to this question is that we shouldn't allow romantic idealism to dissuade us from practicality. This is easier said than done, however, as it's often difficult to recognize Quixotism in oneself. To answer this question more thoroughly, I'm going to refer back to the novel which brought this word into our lexicon. The character Don Quixote is driven to the point of insanity by his obsession with the concept of knightly chivalry, expending all of his resources to acquire book after book on the subject. He then goes out into the world with the goal of living out his fantasies. He tries to imitate the noble deeds of the knights whose adventures he had read about and embody the ideals of knightly chivalry, but he just ends up making a fool of himself. In fact, there exists another phrase inspired by Don Quixote, in particular the scene where he charges at the windmills after mistaking them for long-armed monsters. The phrase tilting at windmills means to invent a problem in order to have something to fight against where one does not exist in reality. Obviously, the windmills didn't constitute a menace. Don Quixote simply wanted an enemy to fight against so he could prove himself in accordance with his lofty and fanciful ideals of knightliness. The essence of the comedic farce of the novel is that Don Quixote lives entirely in abstractions while being totally oblivious to the actuality of the world around him. The virtue of a knight is that he is a force for order who brings stability to the domain which he serves, but Don Quixote doesn't attempt to embody this virtue within the circumstances of the world he inhabits. He simply read these stories of knights fighting fearsome monsters, and he believes that to be a chivalrous knight, he just needs to find a monster to fight, because that's what knights do. He has no regard for context. The farcical humor is that he thinks he's valiantly charging at a menacing foe in the windmills, when in reality, he's just fatuously running into an inanimate object. I believe this is the driving force behind the phenomenon of Quixotism. People engage in Quixotic thinking when they place greater value on abstraction than on concrete reality. When Mao Zedong embarked on his so-called Great Leap Forward, he didn't set out with the goal of bettering the Chinese economy. His goal was to prove his preconceived political doctrine correct. Much like with Don Quixote's obsession with tales of knightly chivalry, Mao only cared for the text of his political ideology. For Mao, the actual flesh and blood of the Chinese people were simply fodder to be fed into the machine in pursuit of his dream of creating the Marxist utopia. These various factions of the right have done their fair share of the same over the past decade or so. Their preoccupation with the abstract rather than the concrete is what has led them into Quixotism. For the conservative, these abstractions are individualism, constitutionalism, and quote-unquote Western values, whatever that even means. For the libertarian, it's quote-unquote liberty, which for them simply means the free market and the absence of state power. For the third positionist, it's their fantasies about recreating the Third Reich. Each of these camps have pursued these abstractions without any regard for the practicalities of the real world. To avoid the folly of Quixotism, one's first principles should be what is good for that which is tangible rather than an abstract political ideology. If you start from the principle that you want what is best for your people, culture, land, and civilization, you can embrace any course of action and change course whenever needed based on what works best in the present context. You don't lock yourself into one course of action beyond all practicality in order to adhere to a political doctrine. For example, I'd argue that Western countries would benefit from a reduction in scope of the enormous managerial state bureaucracies they've built up over the past few decades. However, I also believe they would benefit immensely from strict enforcement of borders, a crackdown on illegal immigration, and a massive reduction in legal immigration. One of these proposals would involve a reduction in state power, and the other would involve an increase. This isn't contradictory if you are approaching the issue from the perspective that the use of state force, or lack thereof, is simply a means to the end of improving your country. You only run into problems when you've adopted an ideological belief that state power is either good or bad in and of itself. The COVID restrictions were an unjust and unnecessary use of state force, while the George Floyd riots were a situation which warranted a far greater use of state force than was actually employed. If either of those assertions gives you the urge to label me a libertarian or a statist, then you're part of the problem. There's nothing logically inconsistent with supporting the right of law-abiding citizens to own firearms while denying that same right to illegal immigrants and violent criminals, if your first principle is the good of your own people rather than some universalist abstraction. This should be the approach taken to any issue. Let's take the issue of the for another example. Influence in education, the media, and government is a problem because, on the whole, they push an anti-white agenda. The Zionist lobby is another problem because it gets Western countries involved in wars overseas, which we derive zero benefit from. Therefore, they cannot be allowed to have such massive overrepresentation in positions of power in white countries, and support for the state of Israel should cease. But does this mean the ANC government in South Africa is my friend because they support Palestine and oppose Israel's policies? No, it doesn't. The South African government is just as anti-white as any Zionist, if not more so, and white South Africans will tell you that the ANC stance on Israel doesn't make their regime any more palatable. Arguing over which one to side with is like arguing over whether it's preferable to be eaten by an alligator or a crocodile. It's a waste of time which just bogs you down in this ideological quagmire and distracts from the core issues of what is actually in our interests. Something endemic to the phenomenon of Quixotism is an obsession with ideology. Now, it would be easy for me to say that you shouldn't have an ideology. Nobody likes to think of themselves as particularly ideological. People on the right like to think their ideology is just common sense, while people on the left like to think their ideology is just about being a nice person. Everyone has an ideology, and I won't claim that I am some kind of exception, but how can we prevent ourselves from becoming ideologues and getting carried away with Quixotism? Here's the solution. Ideological labels should be descriptive, not prescriptive. Quixotic thinking is usually a product of adopting the formula, since I am X, I believe ABC. The formula should be, I believe ABC, therefore I can be described as X. One should adopt the policies which best serve the good of the concrete entities which one holds as valuable, those being their people, land, culture, etc. Based on which policies one sees as most beneficial, others can apply a political label to them in order to describe this individual's ideology. But what label others choose to describe one shouldn't be of great importance to said individual. Based on the views I've espoused in this video, how would you describe me? Am I a paleo-conservative? Am I a white nationalist? Am I a reactionary? I don't object to being described by these labels. My views certainly overlap with each of them to some degree. However, being associated with these ideological classifications by others does not influence my thinking when deciding upon my views on any given subject. These are just descriptive labels, they're not prescriptive mandates on my own thought process. Quixotism is the result of adopting one's positions based on the framework of a preconceived political ideology rather than what is practical in reality. Ideologues across the political spectrum are susceptible to this, including the examples on the right which I've focused on in this video. Because I am a conservative, I believe in individualism. Therefore, I can't take average group differences into account at all. Because I am a libertarian, I'm opposed to state power. Therefore, I think borders shouldn't exist. Because I am a third positionist, I believe state power is based. Therefore, I support a nationalist version of a Chinese-style social credit system. I know these arguments sound ridiculous, but in my time involved in this sphere of politics, I've encountered them time and time again. I'm not strawmanning these ideologies here. I assure you there are many people out there who actually do believe this. To quote Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, "If the rule you followed brought you to this, of what use was the rule?" If your abstract political ideology results in you opposing the good of that which is actually concrete and tangible, then your ideology is useless. Lastly, Quixotism is often a result of a failure to consider real-world circumstances in favor of one-size-fits-all prescriptions based on ideological suppositions. The context in which a course of action is taken is often more important than the course of action itself. Furthermore, not only the applicability of the course of action in the present context, but the feasibility of carrying it out is more important than the actions themselves in the abstract. Classical liberalism works well in a homogeneous, socially cohesive, ethnically European country, but since those conditions no longer exist in the West, it's doomed to failure. A 500-page book on anarcho-capitalist political philosophy is nothing more than a fanciful thought experiment for the sole purpose of entertainment. No state is ever going to abolish itself, and even if it did, its jurisdiction would simply be taken over by another state which didn't abolish itself. You might think third-positionist economics were totally based and red-pilled when the Germans did it in the 1930s, but actually implementing that would require control of the state, something which third-positionists are nowhere close to today. Without power, ideology is meaningless. The focus needs to be on obtaining power first. Only then can you implement your ideas. Therefore, the best course of action for the right is not one which accords to pre-established political doctrine, but that which is conducive to attaining power. Let's take the issue of free speech, for example. On the one hand, you can argue that the ability to criticize authority and discuss the burning issues of the day is a vital aspect to a free and stable society. On the other, you can argue that you can't just allow open subversion to take root by granting unlimited free speech to people who have no intention of granting you the same. Both arguments are compelling. I want free speech. I want the ability to openly discuss ideas and issues without fear of reprisal from the state or private entities. However, I recognize that you can never have totally free speech. There will always be some degree of censorship, and if you're serious about attaining power, you cannot afford to grant your enemies the ability to undermine and supplant you. There is a huge amount of censorship in the West today in a variety of forms, including hate speech laws, the threat of loss of employment, and politically partisan speech codes enforced by big tech platforms. Meanwhile, billions of dollars a year are put into propagating anti-white hatred, perverse depravity, and nihilism. So what is the correct position to take? Given the circumstances today, I think the best position is to support as much free speech as possible. When you are locked outside the halls of power and those inside are doing whatever they can to shut you down, you need free speech more than ever. I recognize that you can never have 100% free speech, and while I would never want to be as censorious as the powers that be are today, if I were in power, promoting outright poison would not be allowed. However, I'm not in power today, so I fully support freer speech because this is conducive to our side gaining power. Now, if I were in power, where would I draw the line? How would I balance the right to free speech with the necessity of rooting out hostile subversion? I would start with the principle that the good of our people, land, culture, and civilization comes first. People will disagree on what really is the best for those things, and they would have the freedom to express their differing opinions and criticize the opinions of others. However, open hostility, such as advocating the mass importation of migrants or the sterilization of children, would never be allowed, because this is in total contradiction to the interests of our people, which must be the first priority. The folly of Quixotism is allowing the abstract to supersede the real. When lofty idealism carries one away from all practicality, one ends up like Don Quixote, charging at the windmills, valiantly through the lens of ideology, but foolishly in the realm of reality. The best way to avoid this is to maintain that which is tangible as the first priority. The flesh and blood are what matter most, not political doctrine. The latter is only good insofar as it serves the former. The former is not a commodity to be expended in pursuit of the latter. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter or Telegram, and you can also subscribe to me on Substack where I post exclusive content. If you'd like to make a donation, Substack is the place to do that. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.